Okay, I'm going to start this session. Thank you very much for being here. Welcome to this event of the Oxford HR Knowledge Festival on Leadership and Board Best Practice in the not-for-profit or for-purpose sector, as we call it. Oxford HR is a global search and recruitment company that specializes in advice to NGOs worldwide. And we are delighted to have participants from Africa as well as Europe joining us today. More importantly, we are very pleased to present a panel with Justin and Ronald, whom you can see here on screen, I hope with me, who will both contribute and share their wise thoughts throughout the session, but I will introduce them in a minute. First, this session will be interactive, and to that end, we're using a tool called Mentimeter, which allows you to express your opinion through word clouds, ranking and rating live. It's a lot more exciting than your usual PowerPoints and far more interactive. At this point, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Ruth Davis, who's a lead organizer of this festival, so that she can explain how this works. Thank you, Ruth.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone, and thanks for being here today. So Mentimeter, as Rachel mentioned, is an interactive tool. So I'll just pop the details on the screen now. You should be able to see now a QR code that you can use to scan with your smartphone, or you can go to www.menti.com on your browser or on a tablet and enter the code 9687656. And that will bring you up the screen of the PowerPoint. And then when we get to the interactive slides, you'll have the option to vote. And as I mentioned in the chat box, all of the questions can be asked on Mentimeter at the end. If you have any issues with the tool, feel free to put them in the chat box on Zoom, and I'll see if I can help out. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you. As Ruth said, if you've got any problems with that, do please use the chat. I've still got, yeah, there we are. Just give you a couple of minutes to get your smartphones out, and I'm going to start the presentation. And it's about why did we choose this topic of leadership and board best practice as a first point. So today's NGOs need to make tougher decisions. Wait a minute, Ruth, on the slides. Need to make tougher decisions and led by a strong board in order to navigate the choppy waters ahead. So while there's an increasing number of causes to cater to and missions to accomplish, funding is increasingly scarce and public scrutiny is more intense. And so this research seeks to provide pointers, even do's and don'ts in leadership and board best practice. It will inform organizational leaders on how best to frame the work of the board in order to allow it to focus on strategy. My guests will provide insights, maybe anecdotes, and share their deep experience of organizational leadership in the not-for-profit sector. So first, I'd like to introduce Justin Wilkes, who is the Executive Director of ECOS, the European Eco Standards Organization. Over his 20 years of experience, Justin has led national, European, and international advocacy campaigns on environment and energy issues for environmental organizations, the renewable sector, and a green politician. Everybody's still connecting, Ruth, on the Mentimeter. I'll go on and present Ronald. Just the last on Justin is, apart from his experience, we invited Justin to join us because of his thoughtfulness, his pragmatism, and unfailing constructive input. My second guest, Ronald de Bruyn, is the Director of Cost Association. And before focusing on the not-for-profit sector, Ronald worked in corporations and consultancies on issues ranging from e-security to the digital economy. He is also the founding director of the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership in Europe and has both led and advised multi-stakeholder organizations throughout his very varied career. Ronald is very eclectic. He's also recently authored a book on the Da Vinci Code in Brussels. There's a guided tour as well. I've been on it and it was fascinating. Just a little plug there for you, Ronald. So welcome to you both and thank you for being here. So now, before turning to the content of the presentation and the research findings, I just wanted to explain a bit about the methodology used very briefly. The research was carried out in March and April this year. It's hot off the press. It's based on 10 interviews of established NGO leaders and desk research on another 10. And the aim was to identify pointers based on real experience on how best to organize, manage, and enhance your board output and improve the leadership of your organization. Have the next slide, please, Ruth. Thank you. The presentation is divided into 4 parts, and I'll have pauses as I go through the 4 parts. The first is on board roles and types and how these align with the leadership mandates. The second part is on board size, composition criteria, and meeting practices. This has been a little bit more complicated, of course, because of COVID over the past couple of years. The third part is very meaty. This is on the board cycle from election to succession. And the last part is what I've called back to the future. This is where we look at the recent past, COVID and all, to seek directions for the future, to inform us for the future. The next slide, please, Ruth. Thank you. So who are our interviewees? Our interviewees are fantastic, and so are you as leaders of multi-level stakeholder organizations. This is not an easy task. To do this successfully, you need to be able to undertake representation, deal with the press, be the face of the organization. You need to ensure continued funding and financial stability and the diversification of income revenues. You need to manage staff and members and other stakeholders, be they governmental or for funding purposes or campaigners. You have to enhance the organizational reputation in a world of increased scrutiny and increased competition. And you need to ensure good governance, such as practicing inclusiveness and ensuring transparency of procedure. Accountability of leadership is key. Next slide, please. So our first finding was on board roles and types, and the type might be referred to in your statutes or your founding charters. It's also a categorization that can emanate from actual board behavior and remit. Next slide, please, Ruth. Thank you. So we identified 4 broad types of boards of directors from the interviews undertaken, and we placed them in the context of the most important relationship in these organizations, which is between the board of directors and the executive director. I'm using the term executive director today, but it can be just director. It can be sometimes CEO, it can be secretary general, but within this world of NGOs, the term executive director is the one which is usually used. And in order for that relationship to best serve the organization, there needs to be clear dividing lines between the respective mandates. Now, we found that the more hands-on a board is, so the management, there were 3 organizations out of the 20 interviewed that are management boards, the narrower the remit of the director becomes. So in our sample, there were 3 management boards that meet often, have a direct say on staff issues and on daily operations. Most of our sample fell in the governing or supervisory board categories. And then advisory boards are the most removed from daily operations, providing the director, and it's a correlation with the widest decision-making remit. A further observation is that the directors with management boards spend a significant amount of their time focusing on the board of directors itself, on board issues and managing the relationships instead of achieving maybe impactful outcomes and spending more time with the staff. Another observation that came out of the interviews, a qualitative observation, was that the relationship with the board chair or the board president is one thing. It's an individual one-on-one relationship, but your relationship with the board of directors as a college is different and has to be managed in a different way. Next slide, please, Ruth. So these are some quotes, so the qualitative input from the interviews and from the CEOs and executive directors that I interviewed. Our board is supervisory and mainly addresses the more sensitive areas of governance and reputation management. We struggle to get the directors to focus, reputation issues. There is a constant struggle between the senior management team and the board due to the board's tendency to micromanage. It should be more strategic and allow the executive to implement and manage. So we ask leaders to think of how the situation might be improved. If I can have the next slide, Ruth, please. Can I have the next slide, please, Ruth? Nope, sorry, the one after that. I'm missing one then. Go back. Yeah, this is the, stop. Thank you. This is the culmination. This is the amalgamation of the advice that we would give. It's towards board best practice. And so we cut these down into your usual 3 types of roles that a board has got to undertake. So that's oversight, foresight, and insight. And oversight is where the board should focus on governance, financial stability, and ensuring the democratic credentials of the organization. This could include transparent application of procedures, of course. Foresight, where they should focus on strategic input, risk management, and future-proof planning. And the risk management, as we just discussed with the panelists before we came live, can also include legal compliance. And insight, knowledge and network sharing, trends identification through pooled experience. I find through my viewpoint as an advisor to complex multi-level organizations that this last element about knowledge sharing and network sharing is of vital importance, in particular during these times of COVID, where we are physically cut off from each other still. I will just pause at this stage to turn to our panel members to ask if they agree or not, and if there's any element to add to this slide here on oversight, foresight, and insight. I'll turn to Justin first, if I may, and then to Ronald. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you for the invitation just to give some thoughts on this piece of research. I think broadly, I think in terms of oversight, foresight, insight, I think it's spot on, and I think it's spot on for the type of board that we would like to see best practice in. So not so much your management board, but more your governing board. I think if I perhaps look at experience of ECOS, ECOS is an environmental NGO, and we've grown massively over recent years. In the last 4 years, we've doubled from 2 million to 4 million. And just before I took over, we did have an issue in that we grew a little bit too fast, and we outgrew our financial system. So I think perhaps the one thing that is missing there is coming in and picking up the executive director. So where the executive director is struggling, because obviously we're Jacks and Jills of all trades, master or mistress of none. So I do think there is that element that whether it's a board or whether it's your leader, your line manager, of coming in and helping you get back up. And we did see this in ECOS back in 2018, 2019. Where the board did come in and help us introduce a new financial system that allowed us to keep up with our growth, and I think that was a very valuable intervention from the board, and a very welcome intervention from the board. But I think otherwise, I do think oversight, foresight, and insight are I think are very nice ways of grouping what boards should be doing and the roles that boards should be taking forward.
Well, thanks, Justin. you and others, if I recall, and I think Ronald as well, did inherit a difficult financial situation, a challenging financial situation, I believe, when you came on board. This isn't unheard of. I interview a lot of executives and CEOs on a weekly basis. Often there is a change of executive directorship because that box hasn't been ticked as well. Again, it's not unusual, but I'm interested, Ronald, in what your take is and your comments on this particular slide.
Well, let me then focus a little bit on these two pyramids, where you see this, I would almost say, balancing act between the board, or the focus of the board, and the areas that the executive director or secretary general or CEO, focuses on. On paper, of course, and I refer to associations like COST, it seems clear what the let's say competency areas are of a governing board, or maybe sometimes you have a two-tier construct like we have, that there is a smaller executive board that is a bit closer to the management of the organization. It is indeed a matter of chemistry between the director and presidents or vice presidents, but at the same time, and that is something that is a bit under the surface and not tapped into in the conversation yet, but I would like to bring to the table. You also have to, of course, take into account the different competencies and skill sets of individual board members, whether they are apt to fulfill the role. Whereas according to the statutes, they may be fully, let's say, legitimized due to the fact that they are elected. So you have to work with what you have. But it's not necessarily a given that these people are also competent in all areas. And that's also something that a director, at least, I talk from my own experience, not only from COST, but also previous experiences, have to take into account. And to what extent do you compensate that or not? And that's a balancing act. And in the end of the day, it's always about people. It's not about the statutes. Statutes are there to serve us. We are not there to serve the statutes. So in the end, it's all about people, and a good marriage between the board and the director and his or her team is the golden, let's say, key success factor in making it work.
No, thank you, it is. And I can think of a couple of examples also where that relationship has not worked and it's impacted negatively on the organization as a whole and on the staff as well, and on the strategic output of the organization. It's always, we're all people. It's all about people in the end. It's a difficult balancing act as well. Another way, another trick or means of getting some sort of balance within your board is if you have an executive committee. And some of the management boards that were interviewed had an executive committee that met a little bit less often, that was more strategic, whereas the management board itself met maybe on a monthly basis, on a bi-monthly basis, to deal with the daily and management issues as well. Thank you, Ronald. We're going to come back to the skill sets, the required skill set to be a board member. As you might imagine, there are board members that are board members just because they can put it on their CV and on their LinkedIn profile, and maybe lack the skill sets for leadership. I think there's a trend towards observing and examining a little bit more the real skills and output of the board members nowadays as we move more into the 21st century, which is a good thing. I'm going to move now on to part 2 of the presentation. Thank you, Ruth. This is the more quantitative part. We will look at board sizes, composition criteria, and meeting practices. It might seem anodyne, but again, because a lot of us are still working online and yet more are working on an international basis, these are important points to consider. Next slide, please. So more than half of the NGOs in the sample have between 9 and 12 board members. 30% have 6 to 8 members, and 10% 12 to 16. Just as a general comment, that's also been a trend in the last years to reduce the size of the boards. And again, you might have an organization where there's a very large board that has an executive committee because it can take decisions more strategically and more effectively than the wider board. That would be another reason to have an executive committee. Because this is a quantitative question, this is the first question to you, the audience. We're going to use the Mentimeter. So I'm going to turn to Ruth now to launch the question and see how we're going to use this. Do you want to ask the question, Ruth, or shall I? Well, there we are. How many participants have between 6 to 8 board members, 9 to 12 board members, and 12 to 16 board members? Need a few more participants here. I can't actually see the third column. None have 12 to 16. Are there any more participants? We've just got 13 there. $14. So most of you have 6 to 8, so it's a lower number of board members. Okay, thank you for that. Let's move on, and we'll retain that, and we can comment on it as we go on. After board size, we then looked at this really important criteria that Ronald mentioned about board composition. So if you believe that a board should reflect all the membership types, that it should therefore be like a fruit bowl with all the fruit in it. There should be oranges, there should be kiwis, there should be mangoes, there should be cherries. The fruit bowl should reflect the full spectrum of the membership. Membership types will vary very typically within NGOs as well. There'll be organizations, there might be individuals, they will have different geographies. We would also look for a gender balance. Again, this is a good trend, increasingly so, certainly here in Europe. We'll look at the reflection of the size of the organization. There might be large organizations that are members, smaller organizations. They are all of great value, but they will have different capacities needed to be catered to in different ways. And then the geographic spread. Now, the geographic spread is of particular importance to EU umbrella organizations, where ideally the organization will reflect all of the EU member states and maybe some third countries. And in that, there are 2 contentious countries, but for different reasons. There's the UK and Russia. The organizations that I have been working with since the Ukrainian invasion have in fact suspended their Russian members for an indefinite period of time, also because of information exchange and the problems with payments. And some Russian members themselves have suspended themselves and asked to be suspended from the organizations. The UK is a bit problematic because of Brexit issues. There's limits to funding and access now. It's just a little bit more of a complex landscape than it used to be. So these elements, these 4 elements are well represented in the sample that we consulted. Underrepresented in the sample that we consulted was the clear and transparent and stated practice of EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion, and ensuring a diverse and complementary skill set. For example, accounting for the person who's going to be the treasurer, or having some legal knowledge about how to set up an organization and the legal limits to it, where the red lines are. HR is another important role within boards of directors. I could add governance as well, so how to respect the rules. This particular diversity of skill set is something, as Ronald mentioned, which I feel should have a greater emphasis on it. There tends to be the roles of the chair, or president, and vice chair, or vice president, and treasurer clearly identified within the board of director remits, but then above and beyond that, it's a little bit of a free-for-all. So now looking at, on the next slide, please, Ruth, the board meeting practices. 15 out of 20 of the research sample meet 3 to 4 times a year, which I think is very typical. 5 to 20 meet twice a year, but these can also include an executive committee that meets 4 times a year. One of the interviewees informed us that she had problems getting the board members to focus on the preparation for the actual board meetings, and that this preparation could take up to half day, a full half day of work. To me, that sounded quite a lot, but then she explained that the 2 board meetings that they have during the year last 2.5 days, and so they are getaways, times when you can also delve into workshops, really identify the nitty-gritty of issues, and therefore that does require a lot of preparation. And one of the challenges for this particular leader was getting the board to prepare properly for this. I think that's a big commitment. Maybe you could sort of cut up those meetings a little bit more during the course of the year. Next slide, please. So again, quotes qualitative information from the interviewees. The trick is to find the right balance between meeting types and board member involvement. And we have 4 main board meetings per year, and each lasts 2 days long. A board member's preparation is a minimum of half a day, so it's 4 times a year. Again, maybe there the better means might be to, and I think this was a management board, if I recall, the main means would be to have more board meetings, but maybe less long, and find a different means of informing the board members prior to the meeting, so they're enabled to take decisions at the meetings itself. So moving on to the last slide now, this second part of the presentation. So towards board best practice, as you've seen at each chunk of each part of the presentation, we have this concluding slide. So we would advise that you ensure that your board reflects the full spectrum of membership types and the geographies, that you implement transparent equality, diversity and inclusion rules. That's also on consultation, HR, governance, policy development, speakers as well. Seek to cover all required skill sets for the board mandate to be fulfilled. And then finally, seek to focus meeting content on strategic import and not spend so much of the board time on reporting. And this is also because you want to showcase your work, you want to showcase the work of the staff. Maybe there are different ways of reporting. I've seen some innovative NGOs put together Vimeos, which can be done very cheaply, very quickly, is entertaining and engaging for the board members. Thank you. So we will now have the second use of our participatory tool. What, in your opinion, are the best practice criteria in board composition? And here we're asking you to write, maybe taking what you've seen on the slides, but what would be the best practice criteria in board composition? We've talked about reflecting geographies, we've talked about reflecting skill types, we've talked about it reflecting gender as well. What in your organization is used and do you think is useful and good? And what would you recommend? What would you share with the participants as best practice criteria? Then nothing coming up, Ruth? Have we covered this this topic?
Oh, there we go. We've got one now.
Oh, goody. Skill set, yeah. Yeah, the community, I like that word, the NGO it is serving. All right, age. Age is a difficult one as well to address. One of the organizations that was interviewed was a child rights organization. Yeah, they had challenges there. They have a specific way of dealing with child participation. Balanced representation, yeah. Diversity of backgrounds, yes, I like that one, and I didn't mention it here, the diversity of backgrounds, the competence to be a board member. Yeah, it's something that we do examine when we recruit very closely. You know, we go back to what was the cultural environment in which the candidates were growing up in, and how has it changed. Oh, this is great. This is very, very helpful. Thank you very much. The networks of the board members, again, that's an important part, is harnessing the knowledge, harnessing the network of what you've already got there within your organization. Faith as well mentioned, which I hadn't mentioned. Good. Great. If I can pause here, and I hadn't foreseen this, Justin and Ronald, but this is such a great selection of choices. I'd like to turn to you for a comment on this. Ronald first, maybe.
Okay, so here we talk about also the setup of the board. How does an organization configure its governance, let's say? Because in this particular, let's say, presentation, we just took the example of there is a board of directors and you have a director. In the cost association, we have a general assembly, which is the highest decision-making body. That is the fruit bowl you were referring to, Rachel. That's where all 40 countries that are member of COST are represented. But then it's really a matter of representation, right? And then you have a small set of that, 6 to 8 in our case, indeed, executive board members. And there the emphasis is absolutely not on representation, but on the individual skills. And that is a very different thing. Now, one of the things that is often overlooked, and it was touched upon here, that I just wanted to highlight as my contribution is, let's say, the self-sanitizing capacity of a board, the self-reflection of a board in its practices, because that always is reflected on a director, and the other way around. The director has a need, you know, also to have a good functioning board. So the composition counts, and if you have, let's say, a setup with a board of directors, what would be very interesting, and I know also organizations that do maintain the practice, that they make the director a member of the board, ex officio, so without voting rights, but is a member. That is a completely different dynamics than, for example, you have an executive board that has a supervisory role and is simply delegating day-to-day management to a director. That is a completely different setup. And I think these kind of configurations also are quite key in determining how successful an organization can be. So this is also worth exploring, I guess. It's different, let's say, compositions in terms of the structure of the governments as a whole.
That was really interesting, Ronald. Thanks very much. And I really like the self-sanitizing aspects that you mentioned as well. It leads me to mention something else which we didn't include here, which was the need for board cohesion. And I'll come to that, I think, when we come to the board code of conduct elements in the next slides. But first, Justin, can we have your comments on this great input on composition?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm seeing on this input, I think, is a lot of similarities between the various inputs, really focusing on diversity of skills, etc., and so on and so forth. And I think what strikes me is that does not happen naturally. That needs to be guided into the board. It's not going to happen through an election that is not a little bit fixed, a little bit influenced. And I think that is, a clear role of the board to facilitate that, as well as the Secretariat. And that's what we do in ECOS, to make sure that we do have the skill sets that we need, and that we do have the diversity, because neither of those we would get through a free and fair election. I think if we had a free and fair election, I think you'd kind of get the elected Peter Principle coming in, or the Peter Principle from an election perspective coming in, which is not necessarily a principle I like all that much, but I think it is a reality. And I do think that one does need to encourage members to be submitting or to be proposing the correct candidate. And I think where a skill set is not available within one's membership, then what we do is we look at co-opting individuals to come in and bring that skill set. So we work within the standardization system, for example, and we do like to have a perspective of a standardizer come in. So that's what we bring in. And we've also co-opted our treasurer as well, because we struggle to find a treasurer from within our membership. So I really do think that the board does need to be, or board composition does need to be crafted proactively. And I know, Rachel, you're coming on to that in your next session, but I think that is how you do bring in these skill sets, the diversity that you do need on a board for the board to function effectively.
Yes, indeed. More than tweaking, firm encouragement, I think, is a bit of manipulation. But as long as the rules and the criteria are transparent and applied transparently, I think that that's an important proviso. Let's move now on to the board cycle. Thank you. So we're now coming to the important part on the board cycle. It's probably the meatiest part of the presentation. What is a board cycle? I'm pleased to inform you that there is general consensus both in literature and practice on this. This has been moved towards the third sector from the corporate sector, and with lessons learned from associations as well. So next slide, please, Ruth. So this can be summarized with the bullet points on the right, reflecting the cycle which is there on the left. And as you see, this is from the board source. I've put the research source there at the bottom of the slide. I particularly like the bit celebrate in the middle. I think this is something which non-governmental organizations don't necessarily do enough. There's got to be back-patting, not self-satisfied back-patting, but well done on the work that you've done because you've done it properly type of patting. As Justin mentioned, you need to identify the needs of the board originally. And so, yes, there are holes to be plugged, gaps to be catered to. You need to cultivate the potential board members. This is usually a volunteer role. It's extra use of their time. Yes, it can be deemed as being prestigious, but it still takes up time, and executives do not have a lot of time. You need to recruit. You need to orient the new board members, engage the board members, educate the board members, evaluate, and then rotate the board members before celebrating. The evaluation part, the appraisal and assessment part is the element which was the least reflected in the sample of 20 NGOs that I interviewed. There was even some sort of confused head shaking, like, do I really want to go down this path as an executive director, as the lead of the SMT? Do I want to be seen as being assessing and appraising the board of directors? The answer is no, you don't have to be part of this. Third parties can carry that out. We can carry that out. I know other service providers can carry that out. It's important that this assessment be neutral, objective, and carried out by an independent third party. Those are the best lessons that are learned. They might be the hardest, but they're usually the best as well. So I've summarized on the right the different sequential 5 bullet points from this cycle as election, induction, this is the onboarding phase, education. Usually the board member's mandate will start with a lot of reading, a lot of networking. Assessment and appraisal. I'm suggesting also that this be carried out on 2 levels, individual and collegiate. The individual can be limited to the board chair, vice chair, and treasurer. And then very importantly, succession planning. Now, these complex multi-stakeholder organizations that we're dealing with are complex in their complexity of networks of people and of history. And succession planning and the continuity in the cycle allows for retention of that history, but also hopefully continuous learning and improvement on the part of the organization as a whole. Next slide, please, Ruth. So there are also board do's and don'ts. I'm staying on a constructive level, so we're doing the do's today. I think you can glean the don'ts from the boxes here underneath. And this is what Justin was referring to as well. And I'll give you the opportunity to come back to this slide if you wish, and you as the audience participants as well. So some of these might seem obvious, but some obvious things are worth repeating as well. So ensure that all of the programs and activities focus on the not-for-profit's mission. I think that leaders will understand that sometimes you're a little bit pulled apart. You're being asked to participate in something that isn't necessarily in the mainstream of what the organization is doing. You will have criteria to decide on what to do or not to do there. Create job descriptions for the board members, the board chair in particular, and keep them updated. This will cater to the need for the skills, for example, for a treasurer who should have some experience of budgetary planning or accounting. Create an induction and education plan for the executive director and board members. This can be part of board retreats. It's something which the organization gives back to the board members. It's nice if there's a win-win as well. Plan and conduct annual board appraisals and assessments. I've just mentioned that they can be separately of the leading individuals and of the board as a college. Schedule an annual strategic planning meeting. It has to be annual. A lot of the organizations that I've been speaking to recently are well into that strategic planning, but it is taking a lot longer than usual, mainly also because of COVID and some issues related to Ukraine as well. We work a lot within the environmental and energy sectors, and these have been directly impacted. There's opportunities and challenges, of course. Ensure transparency in the finances, budgets, and the donations, and stay current with non-profit regulations and legislation. As Ronald was pointing out before we came live, the law has recently changed in Belgium on not-for-profit organizations. These cover business associations as well as non-governmental organizations, and it's quite prescriptive in some areas. All the statutes have had to be redone, and there's also the liability of the board members and their obligations that have got to be scrutinized. Encourage board participation, welcome the diversity in points of view, and maintain a collegial tone in the boardroom. We have also added to recent codes of conduct drawn up for board members, what goes on in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. And so the discussions which take place in the college of the board of directors, in particular with regards to staff, personal issues, must remain confidential. This must not be a leaking ship. It must be trustworthy and maintain the reputation overall of the organization. And then the board should practice oversight, as we said, be more strategic without micromanaging staff. And this also therefore means allowing coming back to meeting practices, time for that strategic input and discussion in the board, as opposed to listening to reports. So next slide, please. Questions to you. Does your organization include procedures for onboarding and succession of board members? This is a simple yes or no. Is this included in your statutes? Is it in your code of conduct, maybe? Yes. How many participants? Aha, some don't. I think, as you've seen, this is very important. I am usually brought in to deal with board problems once the problems have already been identified, or more or less identified and occurred. And very often, maybe 25% of the time, up to 30% of the time, one of the key problems was a lack of understanding, maybe some confusion about what is expected of the board members. And this is why onboarding is of such great importance. Meeting expectations, being clear about the level of expectations from the outset is a precondition of a successful board. Okay, thank you for that, and thank you for the participation. I would very much like to know from Ronald and then Justin, how does your organization deal with the onboarding and succession? Who does it? Because some of the people that I spoke to said, oh, well, my head of programs or my chief operating officer is going to deal with the onboarding. And sometimes it would be you, it would be the executive director that would do that. So Ronald, how does your organization deal with onboarding and succession, and who does it?
Indeed. In our case, we have to answer this question with a no, because there's no formalized, let's say, onboarding procedure. It's also a little bit peculiar the way that our president actually comes into the picture, a new president, because the members of COST declare their commitment to deliver for a term of 2 years a president from their country. And then we have a system where 3 countries together raise their hand and say, okay, for the next 6 years, every 2 years we have a new president. But the board itself does not elect a president. The country that is on the calendar, which of course is approved by the whole fruit bowl, if you like, presents a candidate. So you do not know who you will get, for better or worse, let's say. So that has an extra, let's say, element of onboarding, because this person may be briefed by their country, but not necessarily be fully exposed to the board itself, let alone a bit of the ins and outs of the management of the program. And so typically in our situation, the onboarding is done by briefing the president bit by bit, not throw a big bucket over his or her head, on day one, but just, cut it in pieces and have subsequent meetings within a period of a few months to get this person up to speed. Also, the term of office is 2 years. So before somebody is at cruising altitude and really effective, you're easily a year down the road. So that means that there also is quite a high level of responsibility on our side to make sure that the president is functioning as good as possible. So that is a completely informal procedure. It's not formalized anywhere, but that's also where the chemistry is built and the expectations are set both ways. Because some people come in, or most people come in, of course, with their own experiences. People are used to, for example, to be in an executive role as a member of the board, where in COST, these board members are non-executive. At least the president is a non-executive president. So all these expectations have to be cleared. I think the statutes will not reveal, this to you. So I think, a lot of expectation management, Rachel, as you mentioned, is key to have, to avoid a false start.
Yeah, thank you. You raised other important points there, Ronald, which I think that we can come back to. The element about how much a board member can take on board and when, I think, is important. We've talked about continuous education, but it shouldn't be overkill, as you point out as well. Justin, how do you deal with it?
So I think we do the onboarding much better than we do the succession planning. So we, for example, we'll have an election this year for 3 seats on our 9 seat board. And following that election, I will be onboarding the new members, and I'll be doing that in writing. We have a pack that we send the new members, and I'll also be doing it through a series of briefing sessions. And those sessions some of the information won't be that different to the onboarding process that we have for staff. And I think the key element for me in terms of onboarding is building that relationship, making my expectations clear of what I'm looking for from board members, understanding better the motivation of the new board members. So I think that's absolutely key. And, it is ultimately at the end of the day about relationships, about personal relationships. Because yes, I have a board, but separately I have 9 individual board members, and I do approach those differently. And I approach all 9 in 9 different ways because they are 9 different individuals. Where I think we are not strong enough is on the succession planning, and I think the reality that turnover is healthy. Turnover should be seen as a healthy element, and we do have 1 or 2 board members that have been board members of ECOS for an extremely long time. So turnover is very, very healthy for an organization, and planning that succession is not something that we have structurally done in the past, although for these 3 seats, we have taken a 6-month process in terms of identifying replacements for the 3 members that were not standing again. So we have done a succession planning, but it hasn't been as structured as our onboarding process has been. And I think the other main element that we are missing is a self-assessment of the board. My board has never done a self-assessment. They've never brought in an independent to do an assessment, and they've never asked me as executive director for an assessment. And I think that is really quite unhealthy for boards not to be reflecting on their own performance and working out how they should be doing their work. What even is their work? What is their role? That's not something they've asked themselves for quite some time.
Yeah, I think you're not alone there, Justin, on the self-assessment. So I said that was the big element, the self-assessment and appraisal element, which seemed to be missing from most of the sample as well. I think this self-assessment serves the executive director directly, meaning that there will be continuous improvements which will benefit the organization, and the executive director usually provides the stability and the continuity in the organization because the board members normally are rotated more regularly. And the self-assessment can be a means of improvement, but realignment as well. And I think that it's a useful tool to the management leader of the organization. On the democratic principles, and in that I mean not sitting on a board for too long. I think that's a very important point. I think that there is sclerosis. I think that there is negativity, I'm afraid, which is built up in sitting in the same position for too long. Be that as a management role or sitting on a board itself. There has to be rotation, there has to be diversity in the persona of the board members, but also in their skill sets and what they do. And that will ensure that the organizations can continue to grow and improve. I mean, for me, it's part of the, self-confirming cycle as well. Thank you for that. I hope there will be some questions on this. I think it's an important area. If we can move on now to the final part of the presentation itself. And so this is Back to the Future. We're going to look at the future by learning from the recent past. So that's the idea of Back to the Future. Usually when one seeks to identify trends, you would do so by analyzing what would usually be a similar past, but that has not been the case for the past 2 years. And looking ahead with the escalation in the Ukraine, the future might also be unpredictable. These are unusual times. I have looked at boards and assessed them over the past 15 years, and we have never looked and had to carry out our research in the way that we're doing at the moment, which is why this is interesting and why it is live and interactive. Next slide, please. So we asked our interviewees what their top 3 priorities are looking ahead to the next 2 years. These were, maybe not surprisingly, staff management and retention, ensuring funding and financial stability, and ensuring that the strategic goals are implementable and measurable. I'll just comment very briefly on these 3 bullet points. You've heard of the Great Resignation. So people resigning from organizations over this period of time of COVID because they've discovered other parts of life, not least maybe staying at home. I adopted a cat, what can I say? However, during this period of time, it's not just been resignation, it's been a changeover of jobs. And we can say this at Oxford HR because we're recruiters and we observe the market. And the changes have been occurring in favor of jobs which provide a perceived better quality of life. So this isn't more pay, it's more flexibility in time, it's more flexibility in where you actually work, and less pressure in relation to deadlines. One of the things that I've seen are candidates actually looking at the holiday days and sort of comparing equal offers, except for going for where there's a longer holiday period. The financial stability element is also related to a change in approach, in particular of EU funding. The EU is the biggest donor in the world, and they are now, in general, channeling funds through directly to member states, as opposed to just in Brussels or to NGO EU umbrella organizations. And then on the last point, ensuring that strategic goals are implementable and measurable. This is an ongoing trend where NGOs, as they come under greater scrutiny, are under more pressure of performance, and so measurement of impact in relation to the cause, are having to demonstrate to donors and funders alike, and maybe members as well, and wider EU policy decision makers maybe, or international decision makers, that they are focused on continuous improvement, that they are really tangibly achieving their missions that they set out to do. And to be able to demonstrate that, you have to set out measurable targets, measurable goals, and ensure that they're workable. And so now we're going to come to our final use of Mentimeter. What other priorities might you add? I've just commented on those sort of 3 big blocks, but with your experience and as participants now, after you've listened to the presentation, you've been able to project a little bit ahead. What would be your priorities, sorry, over the next 2 years, and what would you look at? What might you focus at, and what issue areas? These can be small, they can be wide. Let's see what you can identify as further priorities. One of the things I will be looking at more closely is also that board education and appraisal system, and adapting it to more complex structures within the boards. You got any input here on these priorities? You're busy writing. Oh, there we are, coming up. It's going to be a word cloud: digital transformation, scaling impact, a culture of safety. Yes, good. We've been including legal terminology, for example, on whistleblowing for within the organizations in codes of conducts and statutes over the past couple of months as well. Business resilience, ethics. Is this ethics of board members, I'm assuming? And I think this brings us back to the code of conduct. Yeah, the board in a new normal is what a lot of this research is about. What are we doing looking ahead? Have we modified how we strategically plan? Board expansion, EDI as well. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Ethics of not just the board, but of the organization and staff. Okay. I guess this is above and beyond your contracts of employment as well, because sometimes they're quite detailed in relation to that. You can have a staff code of conduct as well as a board code of conduct. NGOs often have member codes of conduct as well. And as I've mentioned, in some areas, this is a very heightened importance, for example, in children's rights and participation. Board support to management and dealing with conflicts of interest. Yep. This also comes with the better management of your board. I think that professional and committed executives are often very much focused on their performance and demonstrating to the board of directors that the mission has been fulfilled, that all these boxes have been ticked in relation to procedure, that the staff are performing well. It can go the other way as well. And there can be another way of ensuring that the board supports the management with contacts, with network, with input, with skills. And the board chair or president is usually the one that's got to resolve conflicts, but hopefully with a means of doing it and with support of the management. Income diversification, yes, and sustainability and flexibility as well. I think I've just mentioned them also in relation to employment. These are the big elements that candidates are looking for at the moment. And at the moment, it's a candidates market. Okay, thank you very much. I would like to ask Ronald and Justin to comment on these results. So Justin, first, I think you mentioned a couple of elements that you wanted to focus on. What would you want to see here?
I think from my personal perspective, it will certainly be on the board's assessment, and I think further developing our succession planning and developing clear roles and responsibilities for board members and how the board operates. I think that's absolutely key. But I think there's a few issues here that I also like to pick out on. One of the very healthy exercises we did do in ECOS is develop a fundraising strategy that obviously had diversification of our funding streams as one of our objectives. That whole thought process was extremely valuable for the Secretariat, extremely valuable for the organization. So I think these types of exercises, it's not even necessarily the final document that is adopted that it's important. It's a thought process that one goes through in developing your communication strategy, your membership strategy, your fundraising strategy, or your overall strategy. So I think that's what I really do see as really quite valuable from boards and board members, is bringing in that thought process and making the executive director think and going through the process. And I can see that coming out in a couple of issues that are written down here, such as income diversification, measuring impact, again, something that we've done. So I think there are issues there. Flexibility, ethics, absolutely vital, I think, within a board, to ensure that the board is operating in an appropriate way. I'm not here to give friends of board members jobs, and I'm certainly not here to give friends of board members jobs and pay them salaries that don't meet our salary scale. And that is something I am absolutely clear on. My ethics are not all that flexible. And if that results in a fundamental issue, that results in a fundamental issue between myself and board members or the board. So I think, yeah, moving forward, I think each organisation should have its priorities depending on where it is in its journey, depending on where it is with its board and with its director.
Sounds like the voice of experience there, Justin. So lead by example as well is what the board should be doing. And certainly these roles have got to be deserved and maintained as well. As I mentioned earlier on, not just putting it on your CV and putting it on your LinkedIn profile. I receive a lot of CVs with the title that the person puts themselves board member. And so I think one of my first questions to that potential candidate is, what do you mean by this? It's not just a title, a job title. Ronald, what would be your comment and input on this very diverse word cloud?
Well, to me, the one key common denominator is performance. If I map that a little bit to our own context, it starts, of course, with a sense of ownership of all the members in an organization, to also have expectations on themselves as a general assembly. But then I think equally important is to do performance management for the executive board members that they elect, to be a bit more closely involved. That also has to do with a sense of employership. Earlier on, I saw that HR often is elevated to the level of the board. I wouldn't want my board to mingle in the HR policies of our organization, rather than setting certain high-level rules, of course, that have to be complied with, and for good reasons. But I don't want to have any parachutages in the team, and vice versa. I think that's unhealthy. But that is a little bit dependent on the nature of the organization. Then the other thing that picking up on the previous key three areas that you saw, a challenge is people refer to this as the new normal, but I find this a bit inappropriate. I think it's more about rebalancing. And that is typically connected to rebalancing, how much time do we spend in the office and how much time do we allow for flexibility to work from home. And bottom line is that in a micromanagement culture, it doesn't work. It only works in an organization where you have a high level of trust, and that people are, let's say, evaluated on the basis of their the quality of the work, the timeliness, of the delivery, and whether they are within budget. So it's really, not about, how do you do it necessarily, but do you do it well, and on time. And I think that is a much more fertile, let's say, environment to have these kind of conversations. And for new recruits, they will come in and ask, what's your home working policy or teleworking policy, or how can I balance this? Or so you cannot afford to lean back, because in the end of the day, performance of the whole organization depends on the quality of your people and your ability to onboard them, but also to enhance their performance and to integrate them in the team, in the collective, let's say, community of the team. And if necessary, indeed, to disengage. That should also not be seen as a defeat. Sometimes it happens, and you have to be honest, but also professional about it. Because in terms of reputation management, it's equally important that you disengage on good terms. It's a bit like, I love you, but you're fired. So that are a few reflections from my side. So I put performance really in the focus.
Sorry, okay, I've just unmuted myself. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Ronald. That was very interesting. I think disengaging on good terms is an important element. We've talked a little bit about reputation management. It's been in some of the lists as well, but it occurs also with employees as well as board members. So it's elements to be looking out for as a risk management area, I think as well. Where I think when you're talking about performance, we're also talking about impact in relation to performance. And I think this comes back to my earlier comment about measurability, which is an area where the civil society sector has still got elements to be learned from the business sector, which has also got a lot to learn about how to deal with staff, for example, and reputation management from the NGO sector. Thank you very much, Justin, Ronald, for your comments. We've come to the end of the presentation now. We've looked at, thank you, we've looked at board types, different kinds of types and their categorization. We've looked at their composition, in particular in relation to diversity and the required skill sets. We've looked at the board cycle, where I've inputted some detail also mentioning the need for a board code of conduct, which I think sort of brings us a little bit closer to the ethical issues. And we've also looked at future priorities and the priorities for future strategic planning, looking ahead in a world which is constantly changing, as it hasn't over the past, say, 50 years. Yes, I think we're now going to turn to the general questions. Are these in the chat box, Ruth? And questions to you, the audience. Please do put them to Ronald and Justin and to each other if you can.
Yep, so there'll be a slide on Mentimeter where you can pop your questions or put them in the chat box as well. Rachel, if you just want to read out any that are in the chat box first, I think there's...
Okay, should I go to the chat box once? Okay. And thank you very much for your questions. Okay. What about the board role on climate? We know boards have not totally seized the challenge of climate, and there are calls for at least one board member to deal with climate and sustainability. Very good point. You're absolutely right. Ronald, would you like to address the particular question on sustainability? And then I'll turn to Justin, who's actually focused on the environmental issues as well.
Yeah, Rachel, this is a question that causes a slight embarrassment for cost. And that I have to explain, because cost is about putting people together in their field of research, so they can network, they can exchange, going to conferences, training schools organized, people travel, to network predominantly. Now, of course, in the past 2 years, this was hampered, and now we are trying to see, is there a new practice or a mix of practices that is emerging, from the lessons learned over the past 2 years within these networks. You do not have to travel all the time. That's very clear. Some things can be done very efficiently. This, for example, session that you're kindly offering, Rachel, could not have been so inclusive across continents without doing it online. So it has advantages. But travel, of course, means carbon footprint. So the only thing that we are mindful of is that for short distance travel, we encourage people to avoid flying. But sometimes there is no alternative either. So we don't prescribe necessarily, any travel methods, but we try to encourage. So cost in its networking and inherent traveling, causes quite a CO2 footprint. And we do not have any specific point on the agenda, let alone, let's say, a champion of climate issues or sustainability. And I think this is actually to be approached, in my view, as an opportunity rather than a threat. Because the world will evolve as it does, and we will receive questions from, let's say, our main donor, which is the European Union. We have to put in place, for example, an ethics board. We have to show all different kinds of ways that we comply, and I quite expect actually that sooner rather than later, we will also get some requirements from our funder on addressing sustainability. So it's just a matter of time for us.
I think you will. I think you're right. Justin.
I think particularly on the issue of climate and sustainability, I think initiatives for ECOS as an organisation have been dealt with bottom up rather than top down. So it's actually been the staff who have been pushing for a sustainability policy. It was myself that was pushing for a carbon tracker for monitoring our travel. That pressure has not come from above, but we are an environmental organisation. So I don't think it necessarily needs to come from above because it's coming from the Secretariat itself. So I don't see that as a weakness for us that the board then needs to, if you like, compensate for or take the initiative and encourage or push the Secretariat or the organisation to deal with. So I think on that specific issue, we have really had a very much of a bottom-up approach.
Yeah. No, I can also think of, I'm sure you can as well, Justin, a rather large NGO where they would have regular annual jamborees of global staff. And this has now been suspended, thank God. It was leaving a big carbon footprint for what was a very large environmental NGO. Thank you for that. I'm going to move now to the other questions as well. Yes, when it comes to gender, do boards consider non-binary genders? Yes or no, Justin and Ronald? Ronald then first.
Sorry, I didn't get the first part.
I'm on the chat. So it says, the question is, it's a comment really, but when it comes to gender, do boards consider non-binary genders? From my experience, certainly it's human being, as long as they've got the skill set and the contribution and the experience, welcome. What would be your take on this, Ronald, and then Justin? You mean female, male, and then something else? Yeah. There's no issue in a board. So if it ain't broken, don't fix it. That's a bit the approach. Okay. And Justin?
So yeah, within our organisation, we have a policy on gender balance. I would suspect that most of my board members confuse gender and sex, and they are talking about a balance between men and women, and they're not actually looking at gender at all. I think if I tried to initiate a discussion with some of my board members to explain what gender is and how gender is different to sex, then I think that
you need a week. Yes,
that would be a longer conversation. There is I think quite a natural culture gap between the Secretariat in ECOS and the board members, and I think that will take time, but I think it will come. But I think a very valid question.
Rachel, yes, may I just add a little bit, because Justin actually sparked a little bit of further reflection within me. Because I was focused on this third gender, let's say, indication of forms. But I mentioned already that our funder requires us to have a gender equality plan. And for that, we also need to have, a dedicated policy. There is an ethics board and so forth. But if you look at a very clear key performance indicator on cost in the networks, gender balance is more than 40%, in some areas even 50% male female. So that is quite high, and also in our own organization, it's fairly distributed. Just at the level of the director, I cannot put myself, or clone myself. I happen to be a man, but the gender balance is very important in the research area, because there is a long, let's say, lasting problem of unequal treatment of female researchers in their career, let's say. So for us, it's a key issue.
Thank you for that. It's true. When we in the science sector as well, in particular. So that's a an interesting comment to make. I'm just going to address very quickly some of the questions in the chat, and then I'm going to turn to you two to answer one of the last questions that's on the main Mentimeter board. But first on the chat. Board facilitation or remuneration. I'm not sure exactly what's meant by facilitation here, but remuneration is the exception by far in all of the complex organizations that I deal with, to be honest, including business associations as well. These are volunteer roles within the boards of directors, to a lesser extent within some NGOs in the social development sector, but it's a rare occurrence. On the onboarding, what we're proposing and positing as a board best practice, that there should be an onboarding of board members. There should be a clarity of expectations between the organization itself and that individual and the other board members of the organization. So the proposal is that the best practice includes onboarding and succession planning, as we've said. On governance of cooperatives, I'm not quite sure what is meant there. I think, is this the French term of the cooperatives and networking? But I'll try and come back to that maybe individually. If you would like to be a board member, position yourself as a board member, one of the key elements is strategic thinking. It's also very much related to behavior and culture. You have to act as a board member, and that means developing that best practice, being constructive, listening very carefully, providing concrete solutions, and put in the strategic thinking. Be a good soldier, be a good member of that particular team, I think is the best way that you can try to ensure that you're going to be a board member without putting it on your CV as a prerequisite. Does the board play any role for hindsight? I'd like that question. My answer to that is yes, but I'm going to turn to very briefly to Ronald and Justin to comment very quickly before we close on that last one there. Hindsight. Justin?
So, well, hindsight is a wonderful thing, I think, in every regard. I think perhaps it clashes with one point I made earlier, that turnover is healthy. So if you do have too much turnover, you don't have so much hindsight left within the organisation. And I think it really depends on the organisation. If I look back at ECOS a few years, I don't recognise ECOS. I don't recognise my organisation. I've been there since 2015, firstly as deputy director and then as director. I do not recognise the ECOS that I joined, and that's because ECOS has gone on such a fundamental journey, in part because of good governance from the board, and I think largely because of the staff within the secretariat. But I think the foundations certainly have been laid by the board. In terms of hindsight, don't repeat mistakes. An organisation that is growing fast needs to look back 5 years and see that, and probably will have the same challenges that it did 5 years ago. So yes, hindsight is a wonderful thing. How one maintains that within a board where you do want turnover and you do have slightly slower turnover within a secretariat is I think a very interesting thing to think of.
Yeah, from my side, I think what is important is that there is both hindsight, let's say presence, and foresight, because an organization is served by continuity and not abrupt changes, unless it is a step change, to take an organization, to a higher level, of course. So it's about connecting the dots. So for that, you need to have, of course, what we then call some institutional memory, embedded in your board, but you also have to have a good doses of, let's say, being able to ask the right questions. So avoid dinosaurs who are blocking progress, but also avoid that new board members in their enthusiasm, are disrupting things and making things worse. So, and there again, and you mentioned it already, Rachel, when you have board members rotating, don't rotate anyone off or in at the same time. try to play with it, try to alternate terms a little bit, so there is, you know, a cohort still serving while the other part of the cohort actually rotates out and another cohort comes in. I think that would be an optimal thing. And of course, yeah, the secretariat itself has a lot of institutional memory. So I think those are a few reflections I wanted to share on this one.
Thank you. No, that's very, very helpful. Yes, it's the memory, it's the history, but maintaining it at a high level, ensuring that there is renewal within the board as well, and renewal in thought and intellect, not least, as well. It's all a big balancing act. This is not an easy task to do. Leadership, I think, has got a little bit more complex. We've addressed this session as leaders dealing with the boards of directors who themselves have got challenging times ahead, but they are fascinating times. And I think that if we follow some of the few rules and findings from the amalgamated research and your fantastic input, thank you again, Justin and Ronald, I think that you know, we'll be going towards hopefully a better future. With that, I really wanted to thank you, Ronald, and you, Justin. It's been, I think, very interesting. And in particular, I wish to thank the audience for their audience participation. I can see that you've followed very, very closely. And last but not least, thank you very much, Ruth Davis, for setting this up and your preparatory work and leadership during the course of this session. I'm going to close this session and say thank you very much to all of you. Thank you. Bye-bye.